Hello, everyone. Welcome to the live stream. I appreciate everyone coming out tonight to talk to us. And tonight, for our design journal, we are going to be talking about rules brainstorming. We've had all sorts of great feedback and ideas from folks, everything from full-blown mechanics that people have come up with to just real quick, simple ideas that people have sent over to us. So I'm really looking forward to talking with everyone tonight. Please, I encourage you, get in on the conversation, comment if you like, ask questions if you like, we'll go through it. But we have a lot of stuff to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here as we take a look at this. Now, the one thing I want to tell everyone, this is a very important caveat. I even made a little text banner. This is a brainstorming session. Nothing we talk about tonight is the final decision on what we're going to do with Cool Name RPG. We have a lot of thinking and designing and discussion to have before we start laying anything down as solid. But this is going to be a key piece for us in starting to think about these different ideas and exploring them and deciding what we want to do with this game. So let me go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and pull up some notes here. There's a few things that I want to share with you. One of the things I'm going to share is show you a little bit about some of the stuff that I'm collecting so far. This is Google Keep. It shows you the sorts of things that we're already pulling in information from. I'm just pulling in boatloads of information and starting to collect it here so that we can think about it. Now, there's going to be a lot more to come, but some of this came from our Facebook group to begin with, for example. So let me start by talking about some of that. In the Facebook group, we started out by doing a number of different polls and things along the way to start testing the temperature, right? Checking the water, seeing what people are looking for, what it is that folks are the most interested in. And so one of the things that we did is we asked some pretty basic questions up front to get some information for people on what they're looking for. Now, one of the important things that we asked people is what slows down the game. What is it in your game that you're sitting there playing and you're having a good time playing, and all of a sudden the whole thing sort of starts grinding and starts bringing it down? The number one thing people pointed out was finding and remembering rules for common actions. This was something that just drove people nuts when they just wanted to jump or attack or crawl and they couldn't find those rules. They struggled to get those rules. That's something we need to start thinking about and make sure that we are addressing in the game. Because I have to agree, for me, that's a big part of something I run into. After that was looking up the rules and for spells and special abilities. So first off was looking up rules for common stuff. You don't want to have to do that. The second one was when you have a special ability having to dig in. And I'm not talking about the cases where you're using it in a weird, cool way, and we have to sort of make some judgment calls on how this is going to work. I'm really just talking about here when you're sitting there just trying to play the game the way it's intended and do the things that we all do in every single one of our games, say swing over a pit, when you have to stop everything and look up how to do it. Now, when you're first getting started, any game takes a little extra effort, but sometimes that persists throughout, right? So we want to make sure that that's not happening, and people have said that's been a problem. Another one that I thought was really interesting was bookkeeping. Encumbrance, HP, ammo, all these things that sort of drive people a little bit crazy sometimes when they're playing. Now, I'm kind of a bookkeeping nerd, so I love this sort of stuff, but I recognize that for a lot of people, this stuff isn't really as interesting to them, right? It's not quite as not what they want to do, right, with their time. And then from there, we had things like calculating modifiers, complex rules for simple actions, finding stuff on character sheets, determining dice pools, a number of different things that came up along the way. Now, some of the things that came up as well when we were talking to folks about this is that, we want to make sure that the game is interesting and rich and fun, but at the same time, we don't want it to be so detailed that it makes you crazy, right? It's trying to strike that balance. Well, one of the things I want to talk about tonight is a crazy idea that I've been toying with. Now, I am not saying this is the right choice for us to achieve those goals in the tome of requirements we talked about last week, but I think it's worth at least exploring. And one of those ideas was looking at the way the average group of heroes in a book or superheroes in a comic, which are especially easy to look at, accomplish things in the stories that we read and the movies we like to watch. One thing that you'll notice is that it is uncommon for a hero to go into their skill list and use the same skill across the board to accomplish something. So let me use as an example, I am going to use, say, a bunch of Marvel superheroes, right? The Marvel superheroes move forward and they come to a wall. They've got to get to the top of it. Now, in your average role playing game, there might be one, maybe two or three ways that people get up that wall, right? Everyone's going to make their climbing check. They're making against the same difficulty. Everyone knows the wizard's going to fail and fall and hurt himself. The rogue maybe climbs up without the rope and then ties it for everyone, but it's all doing basically the same thing. Well, in our favorite stories, that's not how it happens. In our favorite stories, the Hulk approaches the wall, just gets furious and just leaps. He jumps up to the top of the wall. He's off, right? He's done. The Thing, on the other hand, also a muscular character, he digs his fingers and toes into the wall and crunches his way up. He's not really climbing. He's just sort of like dragging himself up the wall, right? Meanwhile, Spider-Man has spider powers, so, he scales the wall. The Scarlet Witch has magic, so she floats herself up to the top of the wall. Captain America is the world's greatest athlete, so he just climbs the wall like the ultimate rock climber. And then Hawkeye pulls out an arrow with a grappling hook on it and a rope and fires it up and climbs up the rope. So what we're seeing in these situations is that each of these characters are getting to the top of the wall, but they're not all rolling a climbing roll. They're each using a completely different skill set. And that's part of what makes those stories so interesting. And one of the things I've started to ask myself is there a way for us within the context of the Cool Name RPG to create an equally interesting way to play so that when you come up to the obstacle, when you come up to the challenge, you each have a different way of overcoming that challenge. And so I started exploring some things like, are we focusing in a role-playing game on the right stuff? Remember that role-playing game rules came out of wargaming, right? Most folks know this. Most of the people listening probably recognize this, but in case you don't know, the very first role-playing games, the Dungeons and Dragons, when it first was created, basically grew out of wargaming, right? There's certainly nuance there, but it grew out of wargaming. As a result, what you see in the initial rule sets are effectively a set of wargaming rules for individual characters within a dungeon setting. Now, in a war game, your goals are very different. You are a top of the hill type of view. You're looking down at the action and you're commanding the troops from up there, commanding as you're standing up there. That's not really how we've ended up playing role-playing games. We are our characters. We've become our characters, and we want to know what they're feeling, what they're doing, how they're overcoming these things. It's not that top-down sort of view, right? And so what I started to ask myself, and I know others have asked the same question, is, are the fundamental rules we're using to play our games founded on the wrong set of goals? Where instead of a tactical strategy of making it through a set-piece dungeon, are we really wanting to tell our favorite stories? And I know there was an interesting argument on Facebook recently. Jeff D argued that storytelling is not what we're doing, that everything is storytelling. That's not what a role-playing game is about. I see where he's coming from, but I don't necessarily agree. I think that we are telling a story because what the point of a role-playing game is, where a war game, the point is to put yourself in the shoes of the generals that led those battles and see if the battle turns out different with you in charge. A role-playing game is to live the stories that we're watching on television, that we're watching in movies, that we're reading in books and comics. We want to live those. We want to be part of those. We don't just want to passively observe. We want to be in the heart of that story. And the question is do the rules allow us to do that? Now, we can do it in a very simulationist way, where everyone goes up to the wall, and then everyone can potentially come up with creative ways up the wall, and a good GM will let them do it. But the system really kind of lends itself, when you read how to climb, the system says make a climbing roll. So everyone makes a climbing roll. Is that a good story? I don't know that it is. And I think that we need to think about if there's different ways. Like, what if each character had an attribute that was their shtick, right? Like the Hulk has muscles and Captain America has athlete. And each of the things that you do, you're rolling against that character trait as opposed to a simulationist set of statistics. Again, notice the brainstorming, line down here at the bottom, we're just brainstorming. This isn't necessarily what we're doing. So if you think this is a terrible idea, don't panic. But I do think it's worth us sort of exploring this, talking about it, looking at it, and seeing if there aren't some better ways we can do it, so that when all of us approach that wall, each of us has a character that does it in a completely different way, and the richness of that story will come across. So I think this is a very cool opportunity for us that we could play around with. So now I've talked a little bit about some ideas that I've had. Let me pull out some of the ideas that you've shared with us. We have gotten a ton of amazing ideas from people. Now, just to let you know, if you haven't already, make sure to check out the Mechanical Muse Discord. There's a link on the Kickstarter page, and also on the Cool Name RPG. We have set up a Cool Name RPG category there to talk about these things. So if you have more ideas you want to share, other stuff you want to talk about, jump in. Let's talk about it. But let me go ahead and grab some of the things that's been shared with us over the time. One of the key things that keeps coming up again and again, both on Facebook and on the Kickstarter page, is this whole idea of levels. A lot of people don't like them. Now, the reasons people don't like levels are many and varied. Invariably, one of the reasons people don't like levels is that the leveling system really is an artificial system that limits your choices as you advance. Now, as someone pointed out, I think it was Richard Lee Byers pointed out in our discussion on Facebook, that's actually not a bad thing if you're new to the game, right? If you're new to the game and you just say, all right, here's 100 points, go buy stuff. You don't even know where to start, right? You don't have to spend points on, and you don't want to spend them wrong because then your character's going to die, right? You get nervous and it takes all the fun out of it. But at the same time, that leveling system does have certain constraints. And something that's come up a few times are ideas like an a la carte buying system, where you can spend the points you earn that you receive as rewards, whether they're points or whatever we want to call it. But you spend this currency of advancement in the game on whatever it is that you like, wherever you want to grow. Now, one thing I happen to like about this is that I always spend my points on the most bizarre things that are inappropriate when I'm playing. I had a character that barely advanced, but he had an amazing house that we just went to once in a while, retinue of people who followed him around and helped him do things, and one really cool sword. That was fun. I had a blast playing that character, but a standard level system doesn't really lend itself to that. So I can see the value there of us looking at it. This is one reason why I like this idea of having basic and advanced rules. If we can find a way to package some of these things in a basic way, but then allow people to explore them more deeply in advanced, I think that could be really valuable to us. Let me look at a couple more notes about this. That's one thing I can say about levels in general. There's a lot of pushback on levels. The same with classes. Again, though, what I do want us to think really hard about is, can we build an underlying framework that allows a lot of freedom and yet package up things in a way that we can still achieve that goal of helping people who've only ever played 5e to transition into playing Cool Name RPG. So that's a really tough one. Skills is another topic that came up. Talking about what skills are, why we have skills, what they represent in real life and in the game. There's a lot of discussion around this and a lot of disagreement on the best way to handle it. Now, if you remember the old D&D games, didn't have skills, right? You were a magic user, and if something came up that magic users knew, you knew it, or the GM told you if you knew it. Maybe they disagree and tell you don't. Skills are very cool because they represent this sort of advancement of the character in terms of knowledge and skills, obviously. But at the same time, they can be constraining because people stop thinking about what they want their character to do and start thinking about which skill they want to use, right? It's one of the things that when I'm running games at cons, I have to remind people is, don't tell me what skill you're rolling, tell me what you're doing. It's super important to remember that as we're going through this. So how do we do it? Do we have broad skill bases where we have like one giant skill, like for example, in 5th edition, acrobatics, right? Or athletics. You have these big giant skill boxes that consist of a whole bunch of things you can do. Awesome. But it does take a little bit of the character out of it, right? You could have one person who is super strong, another person who is a great wrestler. You have another person who is a great climber. You have another person who's a great tightrope walker, but how do we represent this? Do we have 4 or 5 different skills? Do we have a skill package? One of the things that came up in a lot of the discussions that were going on was the idea of skill bundles. Garth had talked about skill bundles on the Kickstarter, and having a bundle of skills that are relatively cheap to buy that let you do those things 5th edition style, but allowing you to, in a more expensive way, focus on different things. We could do something like that. It might work. Skill trees came up as well. If you're not familiar with skill trees, that's basically, think of an org chart, right? And you got your top skill here, and it starts branching out all the different skills that you can get and how they're all connected back and forth. This is kind of fun and kind of neat, and it creates some really cool scenarios. One challenge you run into, though, is you do run into this whole part is, where do things start to cross, right? If I have got maces, does that mean I can use swords? And if I've got swords, does that mean that I can use a spear if I'm hitting someone with it like a club? It gets into this whole sort of cross-referencing. Now, GURPS has this. I actually kind of enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. But the thing about it is that it does create some challenges from a gameplay perspective, where you start scratching your head going like, but if I advance my dagger, does that mean I'm better with swords too? So we are going to have to explore that a little bit, but there were some interesting things there. One of the other things that came up, where someone mentioned, I think it was Two Kings Games brought up the idea of the Elric style advancement system. And I think this came up in Facebook as well, where you basically look at what skills you've used over the course of the adventure, and those are the ones that are able to advance. Now, this is pretty cool, and it certainly is more representative of a real type of skill advancement. I will say it gets pretty heavy into the bookkeeping, which, if you remember, was one of our top 3. I hate this stuff, or it slows my game down. Not I hate it. It slows the game down. It also gets into some weird things like, we don't want to try to defend against every min-maxer, but we also want to be careful not to enable them so that the person's like, I'm just going to pick locks all day. And you're kind of like, well, I guess that's fair. You'll get better at it. But is that really what we want to do, right? So it's a tough question there on how we want to do this and where we want to go with it. A lot of this, though, and this is now where I'm going to sort of step back for just a moment from skills and specifics and the feedback we've received. I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about the idea of the underlying mechanic. I'd like to see the game have a base mechanic. That isn't to say that everything will be handled the same way, but there should be a logical base mechanic. Now, original D&D, AD&D first edition, it very much sort of grew organically, and you can tell, right? By the way, I love playing first edition. I like Hackmaster, what is it, 4th edition, the one that's basically first edition advanced. But anyway, the point is that every single thing that you did had a slightly different rule system, right? From THAC0 to advancement to saving throws. Everything was all over the place. Now, in a way, that was sort of fun because you had all these sort of cool arcane systems that you're working with. But on the other hand, one of the challenges that you did run into with this is that there's no logic. Right. There's no underlying logic. And one of our goals in our tome of requirements is that we need to let the game masters and the players be able to figure stuff out when they need to. That's super important to us, that they have to be able to figure it out on their own without really struggling. Because if you got to stop the game every time someone wants to do something to flip through the book, it's terrible, right? It really takes a lot of the fun out of the game. So we need to have an underlying mechanic, and we got to look at what that's going to be. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean a dice mechanic, but it's typically tied to a dice mechanic. One of the first questions we need to ask ourselves is linear or exponential, right? Because a linear mechanic is nice and simple, right? It just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The problem is scaling. At some point, if I'm a 10 strength, what is Mecha Godzilla, right? At what point, how big do these numbers get before we're able to bring in these sorts of monsters and characters and things? It gets really tricky for us to try to work out how to do that. So we're going to have to take a look at how do we scale it. Now, some games pretty sure the D6 West End Star Wars rules, I haven't read them in a while. I was thumbing through them the other day because I got the anniversary edition, but had levels of scale, right? Where you had the same dice system, but then it would have been like starship scale, vehicle scale, that sort of thing as well. That's one way to handle it. Another way to handle it is, just coming up with a good dice system that, takes into account things like, well, for example, Savage Worlds has, is it heavy damage, right? That represents a different type of damage system. Again, it's a different type of scaling that you can do. So we're going to have to look at it. Now, dice mechanics in general, I got to say that dice mechanics are, everyone loves talking about dice mechanics. There are so many cool things. Some of the things that came up, one of the ones that came up that I thought was kind of cool, I don't know, I'd have to play it to see how it plays out, but Garth had mentioned, 3D20, right, on the Kickstarter page. He mentioned, what if you roll 3D20 and the die you get is dependent on whether you have advantage or disadvantage? So you roll 3 dice, and if you have advantage, you get the highest die, or if you have disadvantage, you get the lowest die. Otherwise, you take the middle roll, whatever that is. And if it's tied with another one, then, that becomes the middle roll. It's like, it's kind of fun, right? You roll 3 20-sided dice and maybe you get something cool. Now, it's a lot of dice bouncing around the table, but it could be a lot of fun to do that. So, things like that we want to explore and look at. Now, keep in mind, all of these things are things that as we start to settle into one direction or another, we're going to be turning both to all of you and to our consulting designers to talk about this. Note that a lot of this we're really just in brainstorming discussion phase, because until the Kickstarter is finished, we're not going to really be able to know the scope of what we can do. And so that's why I'm not settling in on anything just yet. And we're keeping things kind of open at this point. Hey, I just want to take 1 second to stop. Just make sure that everyone can still hear. I had some streaming problems in the past, so just making sure that folks just chime in say hello on the comments if you're hearing everything and you're, oh, here we go. That is just what I thought. I wasn't getting the comments. I'm taking a look here. Joseph has said a few things. He was talking about things being, skill-based, for example, being way better, especially if XP is dealt out every few sessions. It ends up the player comes up with a great use of skills for the GM. Of the skill, the GM can come up with a character. GURPS has guns and science skill, which he'd use for a more lighthearted stuff, but they also had broken it down into things like pistols, 45s, Colt for 1945, etc. I think that that's also another example of the way you can do it. You take those sort of skill bundles and work with those. Yes. He also said every RPG needs a good index. Oh my God, you're so right. Every RPG needs a good index. That is vital. There's nothing worse than digging around looking for it. Honestly, part of why I like using PDFs in game, because I can always do searches. So, hey, thanks for everyone for responding to me. I appreciate it. Good to know it's actually working. I got a little bit concerned there for a minute. It's because my comment list wasn't refreshing. And so I think that's why I was having trouble here seeing everyone's comments come in. All right, let me look. We're almost halfway done with this hour. I'm not going to go more than an hour. And I have a million things that I want to talk about. So let me jump in here a little bit. One of the ideas that I want to talk about is this idea of a tree-based attribute system, or in general, talking about a tree-based approach. I know we've talked about the dangers of this when we talk about skills and things, but I also think it offers us opportunities. For example, if you have a basic rule set, and let's say you've got 3 attributes, body, mind, and spirit. Very easy. People understand the differences between them. GMs can just say, hey, make a spirit roll. This has to do with resisting magical power or something. Or make a body roll. We got to see if you can handle shrugging off this poison or whatever it is, right? So this is actually something that I like the idea of that simplicity, but then being able to break that out further. So now body breaks off into 3 different things. Maybe it breaks off into some sort of agility, some sort of strength, and some sort of toughness. And then you have the equivalent for the other attributes. The thing I like about a system like this is if you build it right, at the simplest level, no one needs to know that you can do anything more with it. They just play it and they have fun. At a more complex level, you allow the players and the GM to think through how they want to expand their game. For example, if I'm playing a barbarian, Maybe I don't care what my spirit and mind are, the detailed stats underneath. I just care about spirit and mind at the highest level because I'm never going to use them. I just want to come, I've worked all day. I came to game night. I just want to hit things with a club over and over again, and I will be happy. So give me body stats, but let me break them out a little bit so I can make sure that I'm extra strong, even if I'm a little clumsy. But then you can leave the other ones the way they are. I think there's some potential there for us to come up with something fairly clever that is still fairly simple. And so this is one of the things that we're going to be exploring in greater detail and talking about over the next week between now and our next design journal session. We're going to be talking a little bit more about some of those specifics. Now, another thing that I want to talk about with that as well is that you can then carry that across to other areas as well, to being able to start at that basic level and build your way up. Skills are another place that you can do it. Now, one thing that's come up is time and again, we've seen discussions that have sort of descended into what I consider to be rules. I mean, setting as opposed to rules, right? You got rules, you got setting. Actually, hang on for 1 second. Derived substats. Yeah, there, Joseph was saying that what I was just describing is sort of like derived substats. They kind of are, but I almost would love to see if there is a way to either just add them as you go down the line, or if there's a way to swap them out or something. Because the thing I want to be a little bit careful of is like, well, this one can't go any higher than this one because this one's at its max, but I'm 3 steps down, so that can't go higher unless I pay double. I want to be a little bit careful about that. That's my biggest fear about a system like that. So talking about the difference between settings and rules, one of the things that came up in Magic, for example, and this is where this discussion came up. There was a big talk about spells and Magic on the Kickstarter. Very cool discussion about it. But one of the things I started thinking of things like, I want a gritty system that there's a chance of absolute failure. I want to have something where clerical abilities are different from magic or wizard abilities. I think that we are going to certainly do some things that are going to help to define that. But a lot of that to me is going to be dependent on what you want to do in your game based on the world that you're playing in. So for a standard epic fantasy game, or say a fairy tale style game, you don't really want your spells going horribly wrong, right? You don't want suddenly a person to be burned alive because their fireball spell backfires and sort of consumes them from within. Not the style of game you're going for, right? At the same time, that can be very fun in a game where magic is scary and gritty and dangerous. So what we need to look at is, what is our baseline going to be? And I think our baseline is probably going to be pretty close to what we see in the standard fantasy RPG. That is the base sort of D&D, Greyhawkish, Forgotten Realms-ish type of setting and world. Okay. It doesn't mean that we're going to copy that. It doesn't mean that we're going to make a game that's 5th edition. It means that we are going to look at creating that sort of baseline and figuring out the best way to achieve that as we are working our way through, but while leaving space and options in those advanced rules for people to explore further. I want to be able to say to someone who wants to build a third-party setting using the Cool Name RPG rules, you can build the feel you want. And whether you want spells that can critically fail, or whether you want skill rolls for spells, or whether or not you want divine and arcane to be completely different, those are really setting issues. The rule system should support whichever way you want to go in terms of color of your story. And so that's one of the things I want to be careful about as we go forward. So as people offer ideas, you might hear me say, that sounds very setting based. And that's what I mean by that. We talked quite a bit about influencing the game when your character isn't directly engaged. This is something that I've talked about in the Tome of Requirements, and we talked about it again in the Kickstarter discussion. This is an example, would be a barbarian character in a party that's going to the nobleman's house for dinner. That can be funny if you wanted to. It could be effective, but it also could be highly disruptive to the story. And you want to be able to tell those sorts of stories without leaving people out. So how can you create a game system that allows for this? There is quite a bit of discussion about this. One of the ideas was the idea of giving people some sort of a point-based system that they can influence the game as it's going on, like reach out into the game and influence it indirectly. I've seen that done before. I'm not sure if it was Hollow Earth or which system it was. It was one of the pulp systems, but For example, the characters who were face characters could build up these points that they could then burn later in the adventure during a combat scene. And they could influence, basically serve as fate, so to speak. So the cool things they did in that social interaction scene that didn't necessarily have a huge risk to the party, but was still very cool, then could turn into something that helps them at a time of risk. I think that sort of a point-based economy is very cool and could definitely work. There was also, let me just take a look here. If there's going to be X skills used, Y dice rolled, and Z resources expended in dramatically important combat, there should be a comparable number in a dramatically important negotiation. I agree completely. This is one of the things that people are talking about, is saying, we reduce our non-violent, non-combat scenes down to a single social dice roll or a few minutes of role playing too often. Now, it doesn't happen with everyone in every game. Again, caveats, but the reality is that most systems boil it down to that way too often. And I'd like to see us do better. And I think we can. So that's definitely going to be something we want to look at. They also, I noticed I sort of summarized a topic that sort of got talked about here, was the whole idea of what is the way that this player influences a scenario, even if their character can't, and who grants them the power to do it. This has to do with the idea of, is this innate in the way that characters are designed? Do they have some sort of player ability that your player can then influence? Or is this something that is granted, like inspiration points and fate points? Or is this something completely different, like a completely different sort of gamification mechanic of allowing people to interact? That'll be very interesting to explore. I did like the idea of this whole idea of saying that you could have player stats, right? I choose like what stats I have for this character, but then I also have stats that allow me as the player to influence the world, whether this is luck, whether this is social, whether this is combat, I don't know. It could be anything, but it's another very cool idea. I loved what people were talking about with this. A very cool brainstorm there to look at ways that this could happen. Let me look. Another idea was this player phase versus the character phase, right? We saw something similar to this in the Birthright game. If you ever played Birthright, you ran a kingdom and you had all these kingdom phases at their turns that you would take. And then you'd actually take your character and you'd go out and have adventures and then come back and run the kingdom again. This is very similar. People are talking about having a player turn where the players are influencing the story in ways their characters might not be able to. Very cool idea. I'm not quite sure how that would work. I mean, we'd have to explore that, but I think that would be a really neat mechanic. That'd be unlike anything we've seen before. We would have to see how it fits against that Tomo requirements. But again, a really cool idea that would be fun to explore. Let's see. Let me go on to some other things here. Energy and stamina. So the topic of stamina came up, and I'm a big fan of stamina systems because I love games where instead of just being beaten to death, one side just goes, oh, I'm just done. I can't keep doing this. This is too much, right? Where you can have outcomes that aren't like bloody death. Not that that can't be an enjoyable experience when you have a really good combat scene, but it's nice to have things where people decide that it's better to run away than to keep fighting, right? Where it's better to stop, where you have scenes where you dive behind a wall and just take a second to catch your breath and go, I have to catch my breath, cover me, and let the person restore their abilities. We started talking about different types of ways to handle this with stamina and fatigue and things like that, where Sheep and Garth discusses extensively over on the Kickstarter. And one of the ideas they came up with, this idea, they started tossing around the idea of resource management for all your attributes, right? So instead of dodging an attack, you burned some of your agility, right? And it would come back later, but you would burn it down as you went along, so that if you're getting just too tired from jumping, maybe you just have to, the next one, just sort of like take it and use your toughness to try to absorb it. But each time you do that, it wears you down and it gets harder and harder to resist these things until you stop to refresh these abilities. This is something that I was thinking about as well. And we were talking about in the Mechanical Muse channel, just going, yeah, this would be a kind of a neat way to do things. Another example would be if you're getting charmed, spending willpower to resist it. So now you're no longer just rolling dice, you're having a direct sort of economic going on here. Now, some games I've seen will apply dice to those economics, right? So they become dice pools that you're rolling. That could be very cool, where you're like, look, I've got 5 dice of toughness, and I'm going to use all 5 of them to resist this blow because I'm terrified, right? Another time you might say, look, I got 5, but I got to save them because the worst is yet to come. I think something like this could be a lot of fun. I worry a little bit about the complexity. Keep in mind, again, brainstorming session. I worry a little bit about the complexity of it. It sounds like it might be a lot of fun, but I also don't want to get us into a thing where we've got this highly complex but completely crazy new system that's awesome, but it's so complex that people just go like, wow, that's a great concept. I don't think I can play it, right? So we need to be a little careful with that. But man, something like that certainly adds a cool dynamic and changes it. Which brings up the idea of dice mechanics. Why are we rolling dice in these games? I think my personal theory, and you guys can tell me I'm crazy, of course. My personal theory about these dice mechanics is that we want to be in the story, but we don't want to know how everything's going to go. We still want to be surprised. The same way we're surprised when we read a book or watch a movie or play a game or read a comic or something. We want to not know exactly what's going to happen next, but we do want to push everything in that direction. And so I think that having dice rolls and that randomness is really important to that. I think it's something that we want to make sure that we retain, so it doesn't just become a resource trading system. But we could learn from some of the resource management games that are out there. There might be some things we can do that we could bring into this and do something really cool with it. So I hope that we'll keep talking about this one. This is an area that I think we could really come up with some cool stuff and really change sort of the dynamic of how people are used to playing. All right, so going on from there, we talked about energy and stamina, burn down attributes, as I was calling them myself. Let's see, combat options. Oh, we get into the whole armor issue, right? In D&D, armor is kind of protective, but it's kind of dodgy. Like it lets you dodge, it changes your armor class. That's something that's always been a struggle for me personally, but I know it makes a much simpler system. But the question we want to ask ourselves is, do we want to do something different? Do we want to have armor soak damage, which is kind of what armor does? Now, yes, you could say that the design of some plate armors cause things to bounce off because of the angles. I get all that. I get the physics there. That's very cool. But I'm thinking more just sort of overall, what is armor for? It's so that it takes the damage instead of you. That's different than getting out of the way. Do we want to split these two things apart? Do we want to split apart the soaking of damage that armor does from the ability to avoid the strike completely or to avoid the meat of the strike, right? Another thing we want to look at, for example, is damage related to the quality of the attack. I think that's something that gets lost in standard 5th edition, is that it doesn't matter unless you get a critical success. Whether I hit you with the most amazing, perfect, godlike strike ever, or I clumsily barely hit you by 1 point, it does the same amount of damage. It kind of undermines those cool specialists, right? Or like the best at what they do. I'd like to see us be able to capture that a little bit more. That did come up as part of the conversation as well. And we got some feedback on that, talking about the importance of damage relating to a strike. Which brings us to hit points and wounding. This is something that got a lot of discussion. It sounds like there are very mixed feelings about wound systems. So now, to be specific, in case you're not familiar with what I'm saying, you've got your hit point systems, which are basically a countdown. When you get to 0, you're done. You're dead. Then there's wound systems, which are more like an additive system, where you get more and more bad stuff added on as you go along. The advantage of the hit point system, or one of the advantages, is it's simple, right? You know what it is. You look at it, you're like, well, I had 20, I'm down to 10, I'm half dead. Makes it pretty easy. Keeping in mind that the original hit points, as designed, are not supposed to be in D&D a true reflection of physical health. They're really a collection of things, especially in the older editions. People used to say, well, I've got as many hit points as a war horse. It's like, well, no, you don't. But that represents the blows not really harming you quite as much. You dodging out of the way more often. You not, a 10-point blow to a highly skilled warrior is less effective because they block it, get out of the way, that sort of thing. It's more of representational. But regardless, hit points do have that advantage of being simple and clear. You know where you stand. Wounds are a little bit more complicated. In addition, when do you die when you're taking wounds? And if you do a combination of the two, how do you balance that wounds against hit points? I mean, if I get to 0 hit points and I don't have any wounds, am I dead? Or am I not dead? Have I only sort of taken some damage? This is something that I think is important for us to sort of explore and look at and, see how this works. Now, one idea that someone came up with was this idea of pacing over health. In other words, not how tough am I, how quickly am I dying, but what does the flow of combat look like? I love thinking about this stuff, right? I don't know quite how we turn this into a rule system or if we can for the goals that we have on this project. But what a great idea of saying that your health, your hit points represent the flow of the combat as opposed to any sort of specific physical injury. I mean, it fits into the storytelling idea really well. I like that concept that came up. Another thing that came up was whether wound systems are too gritty. I don't think so. I know some people do. I think that wound systems, when properly executed, are a lot of fun because it makes it a little clear to know what's wrong with you, right? With hit points, I will admit to a certain amount of frustration that I feel like with hit points, you're never actually injured. You're just potentially out of the fight, right? When I'm down to 2 hit points, I can rest and get them back, and then I'm back up to full. And what happened to me? Do I have any scars? Anything happen to me? I mean, where are the stories that I tell after? If you think about stories, people aren't generally injured in our favorite books and movies and things. They take a very specific wound. My hand, I can't use it anymore, right? Oh, I can't walk. I got a limp. John McClane, I walked all over glass and now my feet are bleeding. I can't do it, right? I'd like to see us be able to capture more of that. I think wound systems do that. Whether or not we want to go down that road remains to be seen, but I think we need to explore it because I do think that wounds can do a lot of really cool stuff, and they don't have to be too gritty. They can be very clear, in some ways clearer, I think, than a hit point system at times. Also, initiative came up. This is another thing. So initiative in combat specifically, how do we do this? How do we get initiative going in combat? Who goes first? Do we do the traditional go around the circle? Good guys versus bad guys each have initiative. Nijay came up with some ideas about grouped initiatives where you have different groups within the combat that represent combat units that are moving about, even suggesting you could even go so far as those individual groups attack and do damage as one. Some very cool stuff there that we could look at, especially when you start talking about making it easy to GM the game, right? So stuff was very interesting. One thing that I was tossing around and we were talking about we have a Mechanical Muse Slack we were discussing, was this idea of a sort of a burn up mechanic where you effectively have, or you could call it a cooldown, where every time you take an action, you have to wait a certain number of turns before you can take another action. So if I'm a, lightly armored, small person with good toughness and endurance, I might be able to go every third action. If I'm a big dude who moves slowly and has massive armor on, maybe I go every 5th action. I can go after that 5th action. If I go, I wait 5 actions and I can go again. What if I want to go sooner? Maybe we have a fatigue system where you start knocking fatigue off for every round you go earlier, something like that. And so in that sort of a situation, you could say, who wants to go this round? And everyone looks to see if they're free to go. And if they are, they go that round. If they're not, maybe they hold off. Maybe they wait till the next round. They don't go. Again, kind of a different sort of system, might be too complicated, but it was fun to sort of explore this and ask ourselves, is this something we could do and we could make work? And the thing I want to point out about all of this is that what we're trying to do here is not just fall into the same traps over and over again, right? Not traps. I guess maybe traps in the right way, but not fall into doing the exact same thing because we're used to it, right? Exploring, letting ourselves explore new ideas. So if you join us on the Discord, or if you talk to us on Facebook or on the Kickstarter, please don't hold back. Don't let anything prevent you from bringing up an idea. Even if the idea seems like it doesn't fit with that tome of requirements, that's okay. We can look at it and see if there's a way we can make it work, right? If we can come up with a creative way to accomplish our goals and use a really cool idea that's completely new, awesome, right? That's how you break new ground. That's how you create something new and amazing that changes the industry. That's not our underlying goal, but if we do, how awesome would that be, right? Add something really cool to the game world. Now, taking a look here, make sure I'm not missing any notes from anyone. We are running low on time, so I'm going to wrap things up. We talked about skills, we talked about special powers and activation points. Lots of cool ideas have come up. You know, some of the things that I've heard back from folks that were sort of general is there was a lot of gravitation towards a D20 based system, not because it is like the world's greatest, most mathematically perfect system, but because it's simple, right? Because you get how to use it. You don't have to sort of struggle and think it through. Higher is better, and generally higher is better. So we figure that's a good thing. Another thing that people didn't seem, like we mentioned already, not a fan of level-based systems. General feedback is that people don't seem to like encumbrance, which makes me a little sad because I personally love encumbrance. I am a fan of it because I love the challenge of saying, what can you bring? What do you have to leave behind? I will say that I think I mentioned this one before, and DBJ, one of our consulting designers, brought up this whole thing of quantum encumbrance is what he called it. Now, I don't know if he got that from somewhere else, but I absolutely loved it. The idea that you sort of settle on an encumbrance level at the start of the adventure, and you then suffer whatever modifiers that encumbrance level gives you. But when you need something mundane, you roll a die, and based on the encumbrance level, that's your odds of getting it. So if you chose heavy from the start and you're sort of struggling along the whole time, the advantage is that when you go to look for something, you probably got it in your pack, so you're probably good. So that was kind of cool. But again, we'll have to look at encumbrance and see what we do with it. Can we create a system that accounts for it without requiring it, so that people can take a modular approach, which we're not going to get into that again today, but the modular approach is something that's very important to me. Also, people seem to like fate mechanics that have a mechanical underpinning, but also allow for story editing. In other words, rather than having two separate systems, it sounds like there's a desire to have one system that allows you to use your fate, and inspiration is an example of this, that allows you to use it for a variety of different things. All right, I'm going to finish up with a few more things in terms of our initial polls that we took. One of the polls we asked for was describing powers and abilities. 51% of the group wanted detailed rules of the core effects of powers and abilities with space around the edges to improvise. 35% wanted really light on rules, but heavy on story and focus on powers and abilities, making things up. I would argue early D&D kind of fell into that category where it had a light set of rules, but then you kind of could go all over the place with it. 8%, though, this is where it drops way off, was they wanted rules that create flavor of the effect, but don't necessarily represent a simulation, so sort of a generalized thing. 3% wanted super specific rules for every scenario that comes up. You know, it was a much, much smaller group. So in general, people like a rough framework of rules. Not a big surprise, but we want to ask these questions, right? As far as things that we want to keep at the top of the list of our tome of requirements, one of the things that we talked about is that conversion from 5th edition. With the changes in the OGL, we reached out to everyone to sort of get a feel for how important is that to everyone. 44% of the folks that we talked to said that Cool Name needs to keep easy conversion at the top of the list. This is super important in their opinion. For the most part, the reasons these things came up as important were the sort of straightforward idea that, you know, we want to be able to track those people. That's a big audience, and we don't want to leave them behind. 35% said it's nice if we can offer an easy conversion, but it's not required. And only 21% said, nah, now that the OGL stuff is all settled, we can do anything we want. So, for the most part, people still feel like we need to keep it at the top of the list, but it sounds like there's some flexibility in how important folks think it is. Less than half think it's important enough to keep at the very top of the list. Along with that, one of the questions was, what can we do to make it easy for 5e players to pick up the game? Of those, 29% of the people said making a D20 based system is important to getting 5e players picked up. By the way, we will actually test this with some 5e players to make sure that, in fact, our assumptions are correct. These are all just, our opinions at this point. 27% said the best way to get 5e players into the game easily is an amazing basic rule set or a quick start. 18% said classes, recognizable classes like fighter, rogue, wizard. That's going to be super important. And then from there, it went down. 9% said level advancement, hit points, pre-gen characters, social media. One of the good things that came up, Crystal Mazur, who is one of our consulting designers, brought up the importance of social media, how-to videos, actual play videos, these things that teach people to play organically. Very good point. It's something that I think we need to definitely look at and think about. What is our role going to be after this is out in order to continue to help support it? And that's a question we're going to have to answer as we go along. Let me take a look here. Yeah, just more comments about the D20 mechanic. All right, let me look at the very last thing. The last thing I'm going to talk about tonight are the poll we did on advancement. 37% of the folks we talked to wanted a buy-as-you-go advancement system, sort of an XP economy, where you get points to spend and you can buy whatever you want with them. You want to do all skills, you buy skills. You want to do equipment, add gear, whatever you want to do, but these points, you can spend them in whatever way that you want. 17% suggested milestone advancement, where it's no XP even involved. It just simply says that, at this point you go, and you could call this levels, but boom, you go up to the next point in the game, and now you add stuff. And it sort of takes you through your career as an adventurer. 11% said traditional XP points and levels. And then from there, we had other things, level, but a la carte, training based on skills you used, milestones with options, a lot of stuff like this. Generally, folks felt like the XP economy systems were more modern, fit what people are looking for today, and they felt like the level-based systems were kind of an old-fashioned approach. And I don't know if I disagree. I mean, it seems like that's probably true, as long as you can make it simple enough. There might be ways for us to package things so that you can have both. And if we could do that, that would be great. So, all right, that is about it. If anyone has any last questions, this is your chance, because I am getting ready to wrap things up here. It is almost 8 o'clock, and my power stayed on for the entire stream, which I am thrilled about, because I honestly was getting a little worried when the lights were flicking on and off a little while ago. In the meantime, keep letting people know about the system and the Kickstarter. What we are finding more and more is that, whatever reason, social media in general is just not getting to people. Even our consulting designers aren't seeing some of our stuff. Even the guys in my game group aren't seeing our stuff. What we're finding is the number one way that we're making a difference is when we go out and talk to someone. If you know someone who plays games, tell them, say, dude, you got to go look at it. I need you to back it so we can get cool stuff. We're already more than halfway towards unlocking Robin Laws as our next consulting designer, adding him full to the project as a full consulting designer. So, go out there, tell people, send them a message, tell them at game night, tell them at the game store, whatever it takes. That's the best way to help make sure that we can do as much as possible in the time that we have. We're off to a great start. We're doing good. I'll be back next week. The design journal will probably be Thursday next week, just to warn you, Thursday or maybe even Friday, a little bit late, because I'm going to be out of town for the first part of next week. But in the meantime, keep gaming, keep talking, tell us all your favorite stuff, come to Discord, and we will see all of you again very soon.